Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Filibuster here on the Nerd Party Network. It's our final original episode of the year, and it seems a kind of fitting way to end how we started. One of the first episodes we did in January was an interview with Darren Mooney all about his book Inside the X-Files, and it seems only fitting to end the year with Darren Mooney again talking about his new book, A Critical Study of the Film. So Darren, you're welcome to Filibuster. It's good to have you on with me in Dallas.
Perfect.
Today.
Hey, so no pressure, absolutely no pressure. But this is the note we're going out on 2018. Thank you very much for having me back, guys. I don't think I've actually met Dallas before, so it's a pleasure to meet you, Dallas. And it's good to talk to you again, Lee.
Yeah, no, the pleasure's mine, Darren. I'm looking forward to chatting with you this time. So.
Perfect.
The one thing that I think definitely all unites us, and probably more so than anyone else, is that, Darren, you've put together this fantastic book all about Christopher Nolan, going through his films, analysing the work of the man, the filmmaker, and the talent. And I just would love to know, why did you pick Christopher Nolan? What, after your X-Files book, I mean, anyone that's read your website, listened to your podcast, knows that you could write about anything. I mean, you do Star Trek coverage, you do brilliant local Irish films, you cover everything. What made you decide to do a Christopher Nolan book?
Part of it was wanting to sort of push myself a little bit in terms of what I wanted to do. Because I did the X-Files book. Funnily enough, I actually wrote the bulk of the X-Files book back in 2015, which is why, for example, it ends with the current series and doesn't go on to the relaunch, the two relaunch seasons. And I mean, maybe if I'm very, very lucky and if the book is very, very popular, myself and the publisher might at some stage in the future look at like expanding that to include the two reboot seasons, if it turns out the show's actually finished. But yeah, so I did a lot of that in 2015, and I did a lot of, as you pointed out, a lot of television work on the blog. So I did, episode by episode through, say, Star Trek, Doctor Who, stuff like the X-Files. And what happened is, after the X-Files book came out, and huge thank you to you guys in particular, to everybody who's been so incredibly supportive of the book. And I always feel churlish when I'm like, hey, I'm on... sorry. Just give me a break there so you can edit that out. But, I'm always kind of... I always feel a little bit churlish when I'm on these things, when I'm like, hey, I'm pushing this thing that I'm doing. Because it is really fantastic that everybody's been so supportive of the stuff that I've done, and in particular, like the X-Files book. And again, even you're very, very generous even in your introduction here. And the X-Files book did relatively well. I don't want to toot my own horn or anything like that, but the publisher was relatively happy with how it turned out. And myself and them were talking about the possibility of doing something else, or me maybe doing something else with them, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I had a number of pitches, but the one that was very much at the top of the list, the one that I really wanted to do, was the Nolan book. And the reason why I wanted to do the Nolan book was kind of twofold. I had this weird pretentious-y idea that I would want to do, like I want to do different things in terms of writing academically or writing critically about media. I wouldn't want to just be that guy who writes about television shows. I maybe wanted to do a book on film, or maybe a book on comic books as well, to sort of to give me something that I could delve into in a new and exciting way. There was also the sense that, like, with the X-Files book, and again, the X-Files book is 100% original content, to be absolutely clear. So I've written episode-by-episode reviews of the X-Files on the blog, but the book, as I think I discussed when I was on the show, was sort of a new overarching sort of synthesis of that. It was an attempt to sort of like put a full stop on it, to be an original sort of a thesis statement almost of everything that I'd covered in the millions and millions of words that I'd written about the show. But at the same time, it was something that was drawing upon something I'd already written. There was a sense in which, like, I was sitting down and I was writing it, and I was pretty much just articulating views that I'd spent the past, say, 4 years on the blog, or, I think at this stage, 2.5 years on the blog, articulating and sort of like working through. So, it was more like refining those and whittling them down. The appeal of doing something about Nolan is, first of all, like, I'm a huge Christopher Nolan fan. But second of all, because I'd reviewed the films on the blog when they came out, and I'd thought a lot about them, I'd watched them a lot of times, I'd discussed them with a lot of people, I do another podcast where occasionally we talk about films and sometimes they come up in that context, but I never really had the opportunity to sort of like to delve deep, to roll up my sleeves and jump into like a film or a project focusing on an individual creator making films in that level of depth. And that sort of attracted me to the idea of doing what the book is, which is a film by film, chapter by chapter trip through the filmography of Christopher Nolan. 10 films, 10 chapters. And it's sort of like, it becomes like this arc of his career, and sort of looks at where he came from, where he went, what each of the films are, but how they also sort of fit together, and maybe why they resonate a little bit. And that's sort of what drew me to the idea of doing a Christopher Nolan book in the first place.
I should ask both of you, and I'll pose this one to you first, Dallas. What is your connection with kind of Christopher Nolan, and when did you sort of first begin a relationship really with Christopher Nolan? Because I don't think it's enough to ever see one of his films. I think people just fall for him straight away. How did it work for you, Dallas?
I like the way you put it as formed a relationship with and fell for, because yeah, he romanced me. He invited me out on Tinder and sent me flowers, wooed me. But no, the first time I saw a Christopher Nolan film was Memento. Back in 2000, and it was the first film I think I ever actually saw at the Belmont Film House, which was Aberdeen's independent film house. It opened in 2000. It's the first film I saw there, and that was a cinema where I ended up working for sort of 15 years on and off. So I guess, Christopher Nolan, I have him to thank for really getting me into the world of cinema, sort of working in cinema anyway. And yeah, I mean, Memento just blew me away. The styling of it, the structure, the framing of it, I just loved. I thought Guy Pearce was absolutely fantastic. And it's one of those costumes I've always wanted to do once for Halloween, but I've never actually got the guts to basically cover myself in a Sharpie and dye my hair blonde and go out and be and be Leonard. But that was my first experience with Christopher Nolan, and it's one where as soon as I saw the film I was like, I will probably see every single film this guy has made opening day no matter what. And apart from Insomnia, I think I've managed to keep up that promise. So
I should add, I'll quickly chime in as well. My first one was Memento, but that was on VHS, so I was a bit too young for it at the time. I remembered being in town on a date, and basically my girlfriend at the time's mum was sort of chaperoning us. She was maybe several miles behind, and I saw the Memento video, and I was like, that looks really interesting. And I had to get her to buy her daughter's boyfriend the VHS copy, because I didn't look 15 at the time, even though I think I was like 16. So that was my first encounter. But I did get to see Insomnia in the cinema at Aberdeen, actually, and the only one I've never seen in the cinema is Following. And I remember seeing Insomnia in a dead empty cinema on a Saturday afternoon at the Beach Cinema. So that's kind of where I went, and I was kind of sold ever since. So, but what about for you, Darren? You've for your journey, you've gone from seeing him at some point to fan to author, and kind of a bit of a scholar on him. How did your relationship begin?
It's great because Dallas sort of mentions like the romantic comedy ideal of the relationship there, where you're just like, it's love at first sight, and immediately that's where you're going to go. I had this really weird thing where it was like the opposite romantic comedy dynamic, where it's like two people keep bumping into one another, like the When Harry Met Sally sort of flirtation is what I would describe it as. Where like I'm probably, I think, a bit younger than yourselves, I suspect, based on the ages we're going for here. But like I would have been about, say, 14 when Memento came out on VHS or on DVD. I think it was one of the first DVDs that we got. And my parents rented it because we do like a family movie night. And I loved it. I really, really liked it. And I wasn't yet at the stage about being 14 where I sort of like, where I twigged, like this is a young director I should keep an eye on. So, I was like, this is great. This is fantastic. And I think a year or two later, when Insomnia came out, it was like, okay, same thing. Parents rented it, liked it. This is very good. Not quite as good as Memento, but it's got a lot of promise, and it's a style of like 90s thriller that I really, really liked. And then basically I remember when I was in college, I was goofing around off kind of college work, as you do when you're a student one day. A bunch of friends went to see the new Batman movie, and I was like, I remember being burned by like Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. I don't really want to go see this. And I went to go see Batman Begins, and it was like, wow, this is amazing. This is like the best superhero origin story ever. That name at the end sounds kind of familiar. I should probably remember that. And then finally, I remember going on a date. I think it was a year or a year and a half later, depending on Irish release dates, to go and see The Prestige. And that was the moment where it clicked all into place. And I think I saw The Prestige something like 3 or 4 times in cinemas. And it was something. It was one of those big, like, eyes wide open, feed it directly into my brain sort of experiences that people who love cinema sort of talk about. It was a transformative moment, and it really, really loved me. And that was the moment where it kind of clicked with me and Nolan.
At the outset with this book, what was your sort of preconception of Nolan as an individual? Because he's someone that does give interviews and does do sort of coverage here and there, but he seems very much a mysterious figure to an extent. Was there something at the beginning you thought, I'm going to expect to discover this on this journey into kind of Christopher Nolan's films to really put them under the microscope, that perhaps didn't turn out to be the case once you sort of dived in?
I think, perhaps the most striking revelation that I had of like my perception of Nolan as a person, to be fair, it is entirely a perception, and he's entirely aware of the fact that he's curating a persona, and like that's the most striking thing, is that he has this persona that he projects. You're right that he does press. He doesn't do a lot of press, and when he does press, it's always very coy, it's always very sort of like almost defensive in a way. He's very good at giving like matter-of-fact answers that aren't actually answers to questions that people are asking. They sound like answers, and they take the form of answers, but they don't necessarily answer the questions that people are asking, but they allow the conversation to move on. It's a very, very sort of interesting way that he handles like back and forth in interviews. And there's a sense that he's not entirely comfortable in them, or that he doesn't like seem to enjoy publicity in the way that like other directors, like, I don't know, let's say Lars von Trier, enjoy the kind of back and forth that exists between people who make movies and the press, who sort of like help sort of hype them up or sort of help generate discussion around them. And I think that when I went into the project, I had this impression of him as being vaguely like standoffish or confrontational, or like just like disinterested or disengaged from this. And I remember as I was researching this stuff and as I was reading more and more interviews, because there's a lot of research of the book. There's, I think, 80 pages of footnotes at the back that all cross-reference all these, like, you know, interviews and sort of statements, and obviously books and other articles and stuff like that on Nolan. And like one of the things that came across in reading all of this material is that he is a surprisingly playful director when he's doing those interviews. He never seems entirely comfortable doing them. He's not, as he pointed out, it's not like he's reclusive or anything like that. He does do press for his films. He does go out and he does do coverage. But like there's a sense in which he is acutely aware of his persona and how he chooses to play to that. And I can think of a couple of examples of this. There's a really great example when he was doing press for The Dark Knight Rises. And this was around the time that you had the Maelstrom kind of, you know, sort of like building in the Guardian's like Occupy Gotham sort of thing, where it was like, where there was this big argument about whether or not you could interpret The Dark Knight Rises as a big right-wing screed or a big left-wing screed. And Nolan is asked in an interview, so, you know, which way would Bruce Wayne vote in the upcoming, you know, 2012 election between Obama and Romney? And Nolan's response is just a simple one-liner, before or after he loses his fortune. And it's a very canny, very clever, very playful observation that avoids like giving any substantive answer whatsoever on the subject, but also like is very astutely observed of itself. And that's probably what I took away. And there's an element of that when I'm reading interviews now, and you have this whole thing where the internet tends to like blow up at things that everybody says, that celebrities say or whatever, and you have these, occasionally with the release of a new Nolan film, you'll get him saying something that will pick up a lot of traction on the internet. And, you know, the Netflix stuff is maybe part of that, but you also have stuff like, for example, before Dunkirk, boasting that he had no idea who Harry Styles was, or that Harry Styles was famous until his daughter told him that he was. And you read that, and a little bit of me is kind of skeptical and wonders if he's saying that with a wink or a nod or a smirk. And I kind of like, that's kind of the shift. He seems, having done a bit more research for the book, I think he's a lot more canny and maybe a lot more playful, or wry, perhaps is probably the best description, than a lot of the people who observe his like his public persona would accept.
One thing I was really excited when diving into this book was to read your sort of insights and reviews of Insomnia, because it really is an outliner in his work. That it's one that he has sort of written to an extent, but it's an adaptation of someone else's work. He wasn't sort of there from the ground up like he has nearly every other movie. What was the one that you were really excited to sort of pick at, look at, and kind of dissect?
I think what's interesting is that all of them became interesting as I was doing them. Like my big worry was that I'd get to one of the 10, and being honest, my entire fear was that it would be Insomnia. And I'd be like, whoa, what the hell am I going to write about here? How the hell am I going to write, you know, approximately 10,000 words explaining why this is an important film, or, you know, sort of what this film says, or why this film is successful, or how this film fits in, like, the thematic arc of the rest of his work, or the narrative arc of his career. And I was very lucky in that didn't happen, and I'm actually really proud of how the Insomnia chapter turned out. But in terms of the one that I was most eager to go at, the one that I was most eager to sort of bite into, it would have been The Prestige, because The Prestige is the one that I could almost write an entire book on. It's I would argue, I think the opening line of the chapter is that it's the most Nolanian of films. It is like the microcosm of everything that Nolan has done, I think, is encapsulated and contained in The Prestige. And you can unpack it, and you can unwind it, and you can bend it, and you just look at it, and it keeps giving, no matter what angle you twist it at. Is it a profound philosophical meditation on the existence of the human soul? Is it a commentary on capitalism and materialism as political sort of, forces at work in the world? Is it a metaphor for the art of movie making, in particular the navigation of this idea between the artist and the performer? And it's all of those things and so much more, and it keeps giving. I watched the film after I wrote the book, and I'm like, wow, there's still enough in here that I'm eager to chew in it again. I want to watch it. I want to watch it again, even after writing, I think, 10 to 12,000 words in it, which is something that's a heck of a film.
What about for yourself, Dallas? Is there a Nolan film where you think that gets you excited, that you always want to kind of keep rewatching it, picking out new things, and sort of getting a different experience each time from?
As Darren says, for me personally, The Prestige is my favourite Christopher Nolan film. I think it is the epitome of everything that he has done, and I think what the angle, what you're saying about with the artists and stuff like that, it's about, I think it's a line something about giving yourself to the role when Christian Bale's character is talking to sort of Hugh Jackman and looking at the old Chinese man. He says this is his life, he has to live that thing, and basically he gives his life in the fact that it's two twins, spoiler alert, but two identical twins who basically have to give up elements of their life and whatever. And Hugh Jackman essentially gives his life to his role every single night. And the fact that he's drowning a clone of himself, whether it's the original or not, I think it's still open to debate. But yeah, there's so many layers to The Prestige that I just think I think it's his finest piece of work overall, I think.
And so for then, Darren, obviously you take this choice to kind of write 10 different chapters on 10 different movies. How do you sort of break that down into sort of researching and diving into the movies? What's your process for it? Do you watch the movie first, then kind of take some notes, or what's your your study technique, really?
Well, the study technique, the lucky thing about only doing 10 films, or and again, it's 10 films plus obviously the shorts that are available. I mean, Larceny is not available, for example, publicly, but it's also like the adjacent material. So it's the books that influenced him as well. It's the films that influenced him as well, to a certain extent. It's all the sort of supplemental material and stuff like that. I was lucky in that I had a bit of an advantage in that I would have covered a lot of that material already. I would have sort of like a casual acquaintance. I would have read The Prestige as a novel, for example. I would have seen the other version of Insomnia, for example, beforehand. Stuff like that, and I'd seen all of the films in question, including Following, beforehand. But before I pitched the project, even I watched all 10 of his films to make sure that I thought there would be enough there to sustain a book. Then when I got the book, I began mapping out what I wanted to cover in each of the chapters, and in fact, again, massive credit to my publisher McFarlane's. They've been phenomenal in terms of supporting me, and a lot of the work that they do in terms of editorial and stuff like that is in helping make sure, and any writer will say this, is the editorial process of making sure that you know what you're saying, and that you really don't want it to be the reader is wasting their time reading your book. You want to know where your argument's going before you write the first word, and mapping out then chapter by chapter what I wanted to cover in each. And so that meant, for example, when I was doing the 3 Batman movies, to focus on the war on terror primarily in The Dark Knight, and not get too devoted to exploring how that theme connects to Batman Begins, obviously alluding to it, but understanding that when I'm going to be doing the war on terror, I'm going to be doing that in The Dark Knight. To say that when I'm going to be dealing about Nolan's metaphorical use of narrative in his films, to say that, well, I'll mention it in all the chapters because it's still relevant there, but that will be of primary importance when I'm talking about The Prestige. That'll be where I tie that argument together. The influence of American pop culture on Nolan's work, well, I'll obviously mention that when I'm talking about Batman, but I'm going to to a certain extent, Memento and Insomnia in terms of the genres that they pull from, but I'm going to deal with that as a big chunk of work in Interstellar. the use of women in Nolan's films, which is usually controversial and something that needs to be discussed, and something that I think that he's in a constant state of dialogue with himself when you watch his films from beginning to end. Well, I'm going to obviously have to mention those in the chapters dealing with individual films, but as a body of work, as a bulk point, as like a big block of text, that's going to be something I deal with when I get to Inception, because I think that's a large part of what Inception's about. So it's largely about like figuring out what I want to say, then structuring where I'm going to say the things I'm going to say and where it's most appropriate to say them. Because ideally, and again, I think I mentioned this with the X-Files book, and this is very pretentious, and I apologize. This makes me sound like I have a very inflated opinion of myself. But ideally, you would read the book. Now, you can read the book on a chapter in an individual film, and hopefully, ideally, you'll get a perfect like synopsis or sort of viewpoint or perspective on that film. You'll get a sense of how I felt about it, or the arguments that I'm making about it, or the cultural context of that film, of a chapter of itself. But if you read the book from beginning to end, it should read almost as a narrative, with a bit of luck. If I've done my job with any level of competence, you should see points that are set up in earlier chapters that pay off later down the line, that build on one another, that sort of all develop over the course of the book to making a cohesive thesis statement at the end about like what I think of Nolan as a filmmaker, why I think that his films work as well as they do, and sort of like why they've connected with audiences to the degree that they have. And that's sort of like, that's a lot of the planning and prep for me, as far as like Map the Book goes. Sorry.
One of the threads I think you have brilliantly through the book, and I'd love to talk to you about, is the relationship between Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan. And I think that's something that's really quite fascinating to explore, their early career when they almost don't know where and when they were responsible for sort of coming up with Memento, and it kind of follows through. And that's a relationship that you very rarely see the two of them talking together, and I think some people look at them, you know, Jonathan is very much the Americanized person in this relationship. And, you know, people sometimes think they're brothers, they're related. You know, you see Nolan in the suit, Jonathan is kind of the jeans and a shirt. What was it like researching kind of that relationship? Because Jonathan seems to be someone that kind of goes under the radar for a lot of people when they talk about Nolan, but not for your book.
I mean, there's the, you know, they talk about how they have basically a symbiotic relationship where a lot of what they do, particularly earlier in their career, will have been bounced off one another. They describe like, and I think that it's something that most siblings can relate to. You don't necessarily have to be working in creative arts to understand the jealousy test, which is like, has your brother had an idea that's so good it makes you jealous? And one of the things that works very well, I think, in the dynamic between Jonathan and Chris is that you do have that push and pull between them. You have this sense of, like you pointed out, the fact that they can't remember where they came up with the idea for Memento. They both know it happened on a car journey between like Chicago and Los Angeles. They just can't agree with where, like, they articulated that idea and where they began bouncing it back and forth on that road trip. But you also have even things like, for example, Christopher talking about how after Memento was released, they would have discussions about the role of the director and the role of the audience in like contextualizing that. In that, like, Christopher, when he was asked questions about Memento, would answer them like honestly and directly. And Jonathan, I think, would actually call him a bonehead. And at one stage, like, hit him, like, you know, as brothers tend to do, for answering a question directly about the film, about what he thought had happened. And, like, there's a sense that, yes, that Jonathan is maybe a bit more playful, a bit more sort of coy, and you're right, a bit more Americanized in terms of the way that he does. He's a lot more candid in interviews in talking about what he's doing, and in particular in talking about what his themes are. And like, it's telling, for example, that a lot of the commentary on the development of, say, Interstellar, which is an interesting project because it's one that the two brothers worked on, but not necessarily simultaneously. Jonathan was working on it when it was supposed to be a Spielberg film, and he then passed it over to Christopher, who sort of took almost sole ownership of it when he was developing it as a feature film for himself. And Jonathan is a lot more candid talking about like the changes that were made to his script and his ideas than Christopher is, in terms of acknowledging what he added to the script as he went. And so you do have that interesting sort of push and pull between them. And there's a point where I'm talking, I think, in Memento, where I'm saying that, like, you can see that there are maybe certain ideas that lean more towards Jonathan and more towards Christopher. Jonathan is maybe more overtly political in terms of his writing. Like, he's the person who wrote, for example, Westworld, but he also did Person of Interest. And you can see a lot of that in the Dark Knight trilogy. You can see, like, for example, the machine at the climax of the Dark Knight is very similar to the machine that's, like, the core of Person of Interest. You can see, for example, the Dark Knight Rises dealing with, like, issues of revolution and inequality in a way that foreshadows like work that he would do on Westworld. And so it's interesting to try and like separate it, you know, say, is that a Jonathan idea or is that a Christopher idea? Now, an element of this is, like most creative partnerships, they won't come out and say, I did X, Christopher did Y. And there's an element of, like, trying to reverse engineer an omelette to this, in terms of, like, I think that the two of them work very well together because they're suited to work well together. And I think that trying to pick apart or to, like, say that's a Jonathan line in the script or Christopher line in the script is ultimately fruitless. But I do think that they play very well, and they have particular interests and strengths where they sort of bounce off each other very, very well.
I wonder with that playfulness is that you maybe get an answer from one of them. Like, I love that bit when you're in Memento when they're talking about that argument about why did you say that, and I think you highlight as well that thankfully that moment where he explained something with the plot was never actually recorded, so it was just sort of became a word of mouth thing. What was it like, sort of, you're a smart guy, a great writer, a great researcher. How do you take that and then you have something like Nolan where you think, my research and what I kind of know about the guy, his themes and what I can see in the work is telling me this, but is he being playful? Is he being serious when he tells me that actually the movie means B? How do you sort of kind of make that argument to yourself about which way you kind of go down and explaining what he was maybe doing?
Well, the first thing is that I try to be entirely honest with the reader when you're reading the book. And in particular, like, there are moments in the text where I will have footnotes on my thematic analysis. And I will explicitly say that Nolan has discounted this reading as an author. And, like, I'm thinking, for example, of In The Dark Knight Rises, where I make the argument that, like, the use of ice in the film is thematically relevant. It represents the, like, fracturing of the surface of the veneer of civility and the breakdown of civic order. And that's why, for example, the film opens with, like, the Batman symbol carved out of cracking ice, and then you have that, like, later on sequence where you're exiled onto the ice, where you're trying to cross it, and it just cracks and falls out from underneath you, in the same way that, like, the film suggests that society, and civilized society in particular, is just an illusion that will fall apart at the basic, at the, like, slightest touch. Now, Nolan has said in interviews, when asked about the ice, he's quite literally said, it doesn't actually mean anything, it's just a cool image. And it's very important for me to acknowledge that that's what the director and writer of the film has said about the ice. And so anything that I'm saying about the ice is also, has to be considered in that context. But I've also think that, first of all, ignoring, like, the theory of death of the author, like the sort of the argument that things have meaning even beyond what authors intend them to have, and that meaning is, like, an act of, like, engagement and conversation with the text, in which the author is not the sole person contributing. It's not a monologue, it's a conversation. I do think that there's also an element, again, of that playfulness that I referred to, where, as you pointed out, you had a story where Jonathan quite literally hit his brother over the head and said, don't ever explain anything to audiences. And you're like, well, maybe that means that it's reasonable for me to say that, sure, Chris says the ice in The Dark Knight Rises doesn't actually mean anything, but that doesn't mean that the ice in The Dark Knight Rises doesn't actually mean anything. And so you have that back and forth, and it's kind of interesting because and this is one of the things that I really like about Nolan, is that you have this idea that plays throughout his films of this like, conflict that exists between the objective and the subjective. The idea that there are objective events, but they're interpreted subjectively. So you have what happened to Leonard's family and his wife in Memento, but you have the narrative that Leonard constructs around that to give his life meaning. And that plays across Nolan's filmography in full, where you have, like, things that actually happened, but how characters narrativize those things. You think of, like, the death of Angier's wife, for example, in The Prestige, where there's this conversation with Borden about what actually happened that night, and nobody really knows anything. And, like, this isn't just something that preoccupies Nolan thematically. It informs his entire, like, manner of filmmaking, right down to the idea of, like, Nolan's fixation on film, the physical construct of film, the thing that you hold in your hand, his distrust of digital, his distrust of the image that you can manipulate through computers, and the actual idea that holding film as a physical object is important. Projecting it onto a screen in a way that he intends it to be seen is important. That's an objective value. But then the audience sitting in that screening of the film that is physical and material, the image that is projected exactly as he expects it to be projected, that's interpreted in a way that he has no control over, and a way that he actively encourages the audience to interpret in their own way, with him having no control over. I mean, there's that famous quote, I think, that he gave at Harvard, where he's talking about the ending of Inception. And it's a rare moment where Nolan is articulating like the whole point of a film in a way that he doesn't really do after that Memento conversation, where he says, look, the whole point of Memento is to tell you, the audience, to pursue your own reality. And so you have this paradox where Nolan believes in like the objective film that he's made, that it actually exists on celluloid in a print, versus the audience's interpretation of that film, which is something that is ethereal, abstract, and over which he can have no control. And his entire filmography exists as this conversation between the two. And I absolutely adore that. And it's kind of funny, and I think that he'd probably even find it a bit wry himself, that the criticism of his work, including my own book, exists sort of in that space, where I am interpreting this thing that exists. I'm making a subjective argument about it. That argument may not be entirely what he intended. It may not be what he explicitly committed to film, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, and it doesn't mean it's not convincing, and it doesn't mean that it's not real. And I think that that's like that it makes criticism of Nolan itself a Nolanian act, which I find, is incredibly pretentious to say it like that, but I also think it's very funny and very wry and very playful in its own weird way.
I'm curious, and I suppose this is a question for both of you. Unfortunately, you weren't able to interview Christopher Nolan for your book, so I will say two each to you. We turn around between them. If you could interview Christopher Nolan about kind of the making of your book, or for you, Dallas, as a fan, what questions would you ask him if you had the chance? If you had that two questions that you could pose to him on the red carpet or in a hotel room or over a Skype call, what would you go with? And we'll go with you first, Dallas. What would you do?
I'd probably like to ask his thoughts on the sort of themes of time and memory in his films, because time, if you look at sort of Inception, as you go deeper and deeper into the brain, time, sort of the length of a minute extends and then in Interstellar, there's a theme of time where on one planet, due to the black hole and stuff like that, there's it's like a year per minute you're down there. And then literally in Dunkirk, where you've got the sort of same time period but played out over sort of 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour, to the point where he literally has his own watch ticking in the background as part of the soundtrack, and bringing it back into the memories. In Prestige, you've got people looking back over their memories through diaries. Memento is literally, about a man who can't trust his own memory. And so those are the themes I'd probably like to explore with him, if he was willing to, actually get into the nitty-gritty about his films and take on the conversation. If his brother wasn't there to hit him over the head. So
what would your... Absolutely. What would your first question be to Christopher Nolan if you could have interviewed him for your book, Darren?
I think I'm half tempted to say, does the ice in The Dark Knight Rises really just there because it's cool? But that would be a very flippant answer. And I'm kind of like, it's the same thing that Dallas mentioned, where you're wary of like asking a question and getting a deliberately evasive, very smart, very canny answer that completely avoids the substance of what you're asking. I would be very interested in how he responds to, or how he engages with, and I don't mean engages with in terms of, he's talked about how he doesn't take a lot of the criticism that he receives on board. He doesn't read a lot of it. But how does he react to its existence? How does he sort of perceive it? Like, is he aware of these discussions that are taking place? Does he think that it's a good thing? Does he like the idea of the conversations that are taking place without his involvement in it about his work? And sort of, does he worry a little bit? Does he ever feel the need like he might need to weigh in or clarify on any particular thing? Because again, Nolan is a highly contentious director online. You have these big discussions about his work and what they actually mean. And I'd be very curious to get an answer from him about how he feels about that, about whether he's ever tempted to, like, I don't know, log online anonymously or like get a Twitter account to complain about it. I know he doesn't have a mobile, he doesn't have an email. But like, is there anything in the critical response to his work that he A, feels is unfair, or B, thinks is very valid and very worth pursuing? And like, does that in any way inform or contribute to his art?
So what about yourself, Dallas? You pose your first question. What would be your second and final one to the man himself?
Probably, had he ever considered ending The Dark Knight Rises on the shot of Alfred Michael Caine looking up and nodding at the camera before it cuts away to actually show that, Christian Bale's still alive? Or the other question could have been, do you secretly have a Netflix account?
What do you think his answer would be to that?
To the Netflix account of the Batman? I think he probably does. He probably likes to keep especially now that Filmstruck's out. I think he definitely would have had a Filmstruck account, so he might need to log on to Netflix for a while. But I don't know. There's something I really liked about the ambiguity of sort of Michael Caine sort of just nodding and then leaving it to the interpretation, because he did such a great job in Inception of ending it at such a point where, as a cinema manager, I would go into the back of every single screening of Inception to hear people sort of go watching it, and then cutting it, and then you're just hearing this almighty sort of, "Oh, come on, it can't be," and stuff like that. It was always such a great reaction. So I was wondering if he was ever tempted to sort of leave us hanging a little bit like Inception.
I think I don't know about you. Before I pose the second question to Darren, that's the one sort of frustration I have in the whole Nolan series, is that it didn't end on Batman dying. That I kind of agree with you. I wanted that sort of more Nolan perhaps ending than the straightforward one that we got. I get that's the feeling from you, Dallas. What about for yourself, Dan? What was your reaction to the end of the Dark Knight trilogy?
This is one of the things that I'm a little hesitant to wade in on, because I worry that this turns into like psychoanalysis, or this is me talking on behalf of people who I have no right to be talking on behalf of. But I think a lot of the ending of The Dark Knight Rises is informed by the loss of Heath Ledger. And I think in particular that the fact that like Nolan's aware that he's coming back and he's making a movie without a person who, to be entirely honest, was a major part of what made The Dark Knight such a huge hit, but also made it such an enjoyable experience for Nolan himself. I mean, Ledger's family have talked about how he would have come back to do the third Batman film, and how the expectation was that he would do that, ignoring anything that David S. Goyer said, because he obviously had his own plans as writer for the series. And I think it's impossible to separate the ending of The Dark Knight Rises, which is giving Batman and Bruce Wayne a happy rather than a tragic ending, from the fact that the film is itself mired in that tragedy, or informed by that tragedy. And I don't mind it for that reason. And I also, being honest, I don't mind it as a Batman fan, because we've had so many tragic endings for Batman that I'm like, I feel like it's okay for one iteration of Batman to give the guy a win. Where you have like, obviously you have Batman Beyond, where like Batman continues being Batman to the point of physical exhaustion, to the point where he draws a gun on a criminal, and that's like, call it a daytime. But he still becomes this lonely old man living in a cave who trains a future generation of Batman, and that's the sole measure of his existence. You have Frank Miller's version of Batman, where Batman retires, becomes a lonely old man who basically wants to kill himself, but then becomes Batman again and will be Batman until the day he dies, which is also a somewhat bleak and depressing ending. And I like the idea of there being an unambiguously happy Batman ending, and I feel like it makes a certain amount of sense that The Dark Knight Rises would be that, given the context in which like The Dark Knight Rises exists. I also think that it comes at a point in Nolan's filmography where there's a shift. I think I discussed this in the book, where there's a shift from Nolan's films in emphasis from like failed husbands and sons towards failed fathers. And the important part of the ending of The Dark Knight Rises, while it's important for Bruce to live happily ever after with Selina, it's more important for Alfred to know that he didn't fail as a father. And that's a huge part of like the themes, if you look at the Nolan films that follow The Dark Knight Rises, in particular, say, Interstellar, where it's a hugely important theme for Coop to know that he didn't fail as a father. And in fact, like, that's arguably the one emotional beat, like you talked about, like the emotional beat of The Dark Knight Rises being the one that didn't work for you in Nolan's filmography, the ending of that. The emotional beat in Nolan's filmography that doesn't entirely work for me is the bit in Interstellar where Coop finally makes it home to Murph, the daughter who has been scarred and defined by by his absence. He goes into the room to be with her as she's dying, and she's like, "Actually, you know what? You go out there and live your life, Dad. I'm grand. I'm surrounded by the rest of my family. I don't really need you to be here. Stop feeling guilty about this." And that's the emotional beat that doesn't feel entirely honest or earned to me in Nolan's filmography. But it's very much of the same ilk as the ending of The Dark Knight Rises, and even in Dunkirk, where you have like the character who's venturing off to rescue the young boys because he lost his son, in the war. because he feels that it isn't right that his generation got to set the terms, but never had to pay the cost or do the risk involved, Mr. Dawson. So I feel I don't mind the ending of The Dark Knight Rises for those reasons.
So what would be your second question? Jonathan Nolan's gone to go get some breakfast. You've got 5 minutes left with Nolan. What question would you pose to him that you felt was maybe left unanswered with your research, or that you just want to know as a fan or a critic?
I would ask about the direction that cinema is taking at the moment, and in particular, his sort of status as one of the rare directors who has this huge cultural impact where he can release movies in cinema largely under his own name and his own star power. Dunkirk is a movie, as much as people like Harry Styles, is a movie that arguably doesn't really have a star. Tom Hardy spends most of it with his face entirely covered, to give you an example. So, like, what is it like being a director who has that amount of star power, or even Scorsese is going to Netflix at the moment, that you can get a film released in cinemas and have it be a big blockbuster success, have it be, without it being based on an existing intellectual property, and sort of have it released in summer, having that juice, having that energy, and knowing that audiences respond to that? What do you think that says about the future of cinema? And also, what is the thing that you're a big fan of, like, advocating for the preservation of cinema as a communal art form, as an experience that's shared in cinemas? What is it that you think is the key to that? And what is it that about your films that I think allows them to resonate as part of that allows them to sort of fulfill, I think, what is to you, Mr. Nolan, a huge part of going to cinema and being cinema and being film? And that would be kind of what I would ask. I'd be kind of interested to see what the answer would be.
That kind of takes me to one of the questions I was curious about, is that where do you think Nolan will go next? It seems to be a bit of a mystery what the next movie is going to be, and it seems to get bigger and bigger. He's almost seems to be not as much as James Bond, but he's gone into space now. He's gone bigger with, like, war. Where do you think he's kind of going to go next? Can he just be someone that continues to make these big sweeping movies, or could you see him returning to something as intimate as a Memento, perhaps? For both of you, where do you think he's going to go next? Do you think there's any clues in his work, or is there anything that you're hoping for?
But yeah, so I don't know. Like, in terms of Nolan's films, and one of the things that sort of drew me to writing the book is that because it feels like, to a certain extent, Dunkirk serves as like a homecoming for the director. It serves as like a culmination of various themes that he's been dealing with. I mean, Dallas pointed to, like, the theme of time as it relates to it. There's all that stuff about parents and children. There's the idea that it's not attached to intellectual property. There's the fact that it is a British story from a director who's talked about how when he tried to make films in Britain following, he couldn't actually do it because the industry was so cliquish and he felt excluded. He had to go to America to find himself. So there's a sense in which Dunkirk is like a culmination for Nolan, which means that, like, it makes his next project very interesting because that's entirely freed. It means that he's entirely free to do whatever he wants to do. Now, he's talked in interviews about that, what you talked about there and alluded to there, the question of whether or not he would continue making big movies or whether he'd like to do something small like Memento. I know there are a lot of film fans who would yearn for the return of something like Memento or something like The Prestige, even in terms of, like, Nolan's filmography. And he's talked about how, from his perspective, he knows that he can't continue to make films on the scale of, like, Interstellar and Dunkirk forever. So he's going to continue to make them as long as he can, and then he'll ease back into making sort of smaller films as the interest in him sort of erodes, as he imagines it doing, or as sort of time kind of, forces him out of the mainstream, out of the zeitgeist, and he's working with smaller budgets on indie projects. So I don't imagine that we'll see him going small immediately. I do imagine that over a period of time you'll see him doing that. I also kind of can't imagine that there won't be in the next 20 years a Christopher Nolan Bond film. I don't imagine there will be in the next 8, but I can see it happening in the next 20. In terms of what he's doing immediately next, I imagine it will be a big thing. I imagine it won't be tied to any intellectual property. I imagine, and this is me speculating, I wonder if there will be something more mainstream about it in terms of awards fare, in terms of recognition from awards bodies. Because one of the interesting things about Nolan is that he has been largely, I don't want to say ignored and overlooked by the Academy and other sort of awards bodies, but, like, you have the famous case where The Dark Knight didn't get nominated for Best Picture, and so you had this huge changing The Academy is still basically reeling from the fact that it nominated The Reader over The Dark Knight in 2009, which is an astonishing amount of cultural impact to have. You've had the expansion of the field, the contraction of the field, best popular film, cancelling best popular film, the expansion of membership, all this sort of stuff. And I wonder if his next film might be something to meet in the middle ground, where you had, like, Dunkirk was in its own way a film that would be more comfortable for awards voters in that it's a period piece, it's a war film, it's not a genre film in the same way that, like, the Dark Knight trilogy was, or Inception was, or Interstellar was, and so in that way it was, like, more acceptable. That's why he got his first Best Director nomination for it. I wonder if you might see something slightly more conventional, if you might see something, I don't think it'll be another historical epic in the style of Dunkirk, but it might be something more conventional than, say, the film series, the series of films running through the Dark Knight trilogy, The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar. But that's just my guess. He's probably going to prove me entirely wrong and do a romantic comedy or something. I don't think he'll do a romantic comedy. But Dallas, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about it, and yeah, I think you're right. I think franchise-wise, I think he's going to stay away from that. Sort of Warner Brothers, whatever, they've basically given him full creative control over his project, so I can't see him wanting to go and do something like Bond or Star Wars, where there's going to be so much external pressure to produce a story that fits into a certain narrative that they want. Perhaps maybe something like a musical, I don't know, but I think there's potential that he might maybe do, moving on from Dunkirk, to maybe something like a biopic, but something that he chooses, not based on an existing book or something like that, or maybe I'd really like to maybe see, given his love of film preservation and stuff like that, to maybe produce his own version of something akin to like Cinema Paradiso, like a love letter to cinema, whether that's in the UK or the Europe or something like that, something that feels akin to the Cinema Paradiso, the Dolce Vita, that kind of sweeping sort of thing, maybe set in sort of the 60s, 70s, that kind of thing, I think would be something that I'd really like to see. Something potentially slightly more award baity, but I don't think he does these things to get Oscars, so I don't think he's really that fussed if he wins or not. But yeah, I think that's where potentially I would like to see him go next. What about yourself, Lee? What do you want to see?
I'm really not too sure. Like, one of the things that got me very curious was when I was reading the start of the book was the talk of this Howard Hughes script that he worked, and he was like, at the time, this was the best script that he'd ever written. I'd be really curious to see that, where it kind of blends that biopic that Dallas is talking about with that kind of early work and something potentially Oscar baity, as it were. I'd be really curious to see what he would do and how he would do that, and what made it potentially the best Nolan script ever.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself. Like, part of me is wondering, like, would he go back to the well and do that? But it's like, because it's an absolutely fascinating story, and you can see elements of it in, like, The Dark Knight Rises, where you have jokes about Bruce Wayne peeing in masonry jars. But this is the one where it was sort of scrapped because The Aviator kind of came out, and it feels like it's been long enough from The Aviator. And as much as I like The Aviator, it feels like The Aviator didn't have a big enough, like, cultural footprint that everybody would be comparing, like, a Christopher Nolan version of that story to The Aviator immediately. So I could kind of see that working. The only question is, would he go back and would he revive that project? And would he do it now, or would he wait until later in his career? That's an interesting question, and I would love to see it. And I think you're right, Lee. It would be very, very fascinating to see.
I think it's interesting, as you were sort of describing, there was this sort of Howard Hughes biopic, and I was kind of thinking when I'd finished your book the other day that we recently had Del Toro come out with, here's all these unpublished scripts that I've ever had, or movies that never came to being, whereas Nolan very much doesn't seem to be like that. Even as a director, there's very little in the way of deleted scenes that we all speculate and wonder what would have that Dark Knight trilogy ended like if Heath Ledger had been alive. Deleted scenes, people are always clamoring them for DVDs, but I think I can only count of maybe one or two that I know exist out there. And I think there's where the Joker's in the car and he goes, that must have been Harvey Dent as the Batman. Did you see the way he threw herself at him, or something after? He's someone that seems to keep things very in-house, and I'm curious to know what would be in his archives of work, of material that never made the cut, or if he is just someone that is so focused on a Dunkirk and Inception that these films get made and there's nothing ever kind of that's still waiting around to be made.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that, like, the argument is that as much as he's a very private person, he's talked about how he doesn't like including outtakes and bloopers on DVDs because he feels like that violates the trust between actors and directors, in that, like, if an actor knows that their bad take is going to go on the DVD, they won't go all out. They won't trust the director to give a completely off the rails performance in a take because they know that it'll end up on a joke and it'll be memeable and stuff like that. So Nolan doesn't like putting outtakes and bloopers on for that reason. He's talked about how, I think it was Insomnia, when he was doing Insomnia, the issue is that he doesn't have that many deleted scenes because he actually tends to like shoot and edit per how he imagines the movie to be. There's no amount of like superfluous material. There's the famous story that Al Pacino tells about working with Nolan, where there were no reshoots on Insomnia, which to Al Pacino was a new experience because Nolan knew exactly what he wanted. I was talking, there's an interview in the book with Jeremy Theobald, and Theobald talks about how when he was filming Following, Nolan would literally just have them deliver. He wouldn't film entire scenes several times over. He would film particular takes of scenes, and he'd be like, I just need from this line to this line because then I'm going to cut to this, so I don't actually need that footage, which is a remarkable amount of vision, and that's one of the reasons why you don't see that much deleted footage. And it's interesting that you talk about The Dark Knight Rises. The Dark Knight Rises is one of the films where we know that lots and lots of deleted footage actually exists because of commentary from various actors and the costume designer and stuff like that, who've talked about scenes that were not in the finished cut of the film. And that's interesting. I think that speaks to why one of the ways in which The Dark Knight Rises is a different Nolan film compared to the other types of Nolan films. In that I would argue it's really his only sequel because The Dark Knight is its own thing. He very much, The Dark Knight to a certain extent takes Batman Begins and builds on it, but also throws a lot of it out. There's a lot less, the color palette is different. There's much less CGI in it. There's very few references specifically to the events of Batman Begins. There's the recasting Rachel Dawes. But with The Dark Knight Rises, there's a sense of it being a much messier film that he's trying to get a hold of, and that he's kind of playing around with, and it's got a lot more malleable material. But yeah, you're right that there's not a lot of fat or superfluous material in what he produces. I also do wonder if we'll ever get to the day where there will be a Nolan archive, in, I don't know, would it be in sort of the University of California, or would he probably bring it back to Chicago, or would he even give it back to the film school in London, is a question as well. But would there be these archives that he would publish? And I wonder if he would feel comfortable sharing that even at the end of his career.
My final two questions for you is this. When you got to the end of this project, you'd written it all, you'd watched the films countless times, researched it all. Was there an opinion that had changed on something that Nolan had done, or did a film that you thought, this is my favourite one, change in the process? And my big worry reading your book was, and I think it could still be the case really with the way things are going, is Nolan had to go to America because he couldn't break into the UK film circuit. That he, Batman essentially was a homecoming for him, but he has always been someone that has pretty much moved to America to make films. He's, given all this freedom there. Do you think we're losing the next Christopher Nolans to America, or do you feel that things have changed in the success of Nolan? We see studios have changed their recruiting skills for how they find directors to make films based on how Nolan went from something like Insomnia to Batman. Do you think that we're losing Christopher Nolans that we could have here in the UK and Ireland?
To answer your first question, actually, very few sort of I watched the movie so many times that I sort of already formed opinions on most of them and most of the things in them. Very few of my opinions actually changed, although I did find that Dunkirk went up a great deal in my estimation as I was writing the book. And in terms of if I were ranking Nolan films, I think I would rank it much higher than I would have coming out of it the first or even second time I saw it. In terms of the second question and the issue with the next Christopher Nolan, inverted commas, and this is kind of interesting because you mentioned it earlier in the conversation with Insomnia. And I mentioned it myself where I was trying to figure out what the thing I was going to talk about when it came to Insomnia, because you point out it's not a traditional Nolan film in that it's a remake of obviously of a foreign film, but it's also a script that existed before he was drafted on to work on it. Now, he did do rewrites on it. He rewrote it heavily, particularly in consultation with Pacino and stuff like that, to help stuff like character motivation. It's very much shot in a Nolan style and stuff like that. One of the interesting things about the idea of a next Nolan is that, studios learned a lesson with Nolan, which was that you can take indie directors who work on tiny budgets and get them to work on blockbusters, and you hope that it works out very, very well. And there are cases where it has worked out very, very well. I mean, you could argue like everybody from J.J. Abrams to Rian Johnson and stuff like that are examples of directors who have come along and have had a very similar experience, you know? And I'm kind of, you know, I'm hoping that there will be other directors who will sort of follow that. Ryan Coogler is a great example of that as well, who sort of jumped from Fruitvale Station up to doing like Creed to doing then Black Panther. The issue is that in a lot of the cases, what you're missing out of that is, and again, it's so easy to overlook, because I think that I overlooked it before I wrote the book, and I think you were talking about like maybe like where insomnia fits in all this. You're missing insomnia. Like, that's the step that you're missing in the next Christopher Nolan, in like this idea that studios have learned that you can take like rookie directors and put them in charge of like $100 million films and hope that you end up with something that is unique and exciting and visionary, and kind of just counting it working out. Is that like, that's not actually what happened with Nolan. He didn't go from doing like Following, you know, up to doing Batman Begins. He did Memento, which was still an indie film, but he didn't even go from Memento to doing Batman Begins. He went from Memento to Insomnia to Batman Begins. And Insomnia was a mid-budget film that would have allowed him to fail, that introduced him to the working of the studio system, that, you know, wouldn't have cost everybody an arm and a leg if it had gone badly. If it had gone badly, it just would have meant that he'd have to go back, he'd do a bit more indie work, and then maybe he'd try again. I think it succeeded triumphantly, and it meant that when he was landed on Batman Begins, he knew exactly how to navigate A, how to negotiate with the studio to get what he wanted, B, to understand what the studio wanted from his film in the first place, C, to work with like that level of craftsmanship and that level of production, so to have production designers, production heads who like are studio sort of veterans or are veterans of films like this, and thus are coming with more experience than people who would have worked on films like even Memento, to pick an example, but even stuff like Following. And that's what you're missing from a lot of the development arcs. That's why you end up with people, I would argue, like Josh Trank, who went from doing Chronicle to doing Forstick, I think is how you pronounce it, but and then sort of imploding along the way. And you could argue that there are even other examples, like the director who went from doing Safety Not Guaranteed to doing Jurassic World, Colin Trevorrow, where you ended up with this horrible mess of a movie that made a shed load of money, but, you know, then ended up with the Book of Henry, which we don't talk about. I think that's what you're missing in terms of like the modern career arc. The modern Nolan today would struggle to get the chance to make a movie like Insomnia before being asked to make Batman Begins. And I think that is where like modern blockbuster filmmaking and modern studio filmmaking suffers a great deal. And that's the big loss, is that we no longer have films like Insomnia, on the level of Insomnia, that allow directors to grow and evolve. And I think that maybe Coogler is closest in that you could argue Creed had a lower budget than something like Black Panther, had lower stakes than something like Batman Begins, and so allowed him like the freedom to do something like that, and I think is an important part of him growing as an artist. But that's sort of what I would weigh in on that.
Absolutely. So if people wanted to, and this is the joy of this time of year, if people wanted to treat themselves for Christmas to a critical study of the films of Christopher Nolan, or give it to their film geek husband or girlfriend, whoever, where can people kind of find this book online and buy it and get it all in time for Christmas?
Well, it is available wherever all good books are sold, and you don't even have to get it online. If you go to the local bookstore and order it in, they'll be able to order it in for you as well. It is available on Amazon. I know that people don't necessarily want to order from Amazon. I completely respect that. You can get it online from various other Barnes & Noble stocking online. You can order it directly from the publisher, which is McFarlane's. It's available online there. I would note that it is also, like, because it is a book that is in some ways considered an academic text, it can be quite expensive, maybe a little bit more expensive than people would sort of be comfortable paying for, particularly at this time of year where you're stretched. If that's in mind, there is an ebook that's available that's significantly cheaper, but also like your local library. I always mention this when I'm on these podcasts. Your local library has a budget for these sort of things as well. So if you want to read it, or if you want to even just support it and you don't want to read it, although I'd really like you to read it, I really, really hope that you enjoy it. If you don't want to support it, you can ask your local library to get it stocked as well, and they'll be able to do that for you as well. So it is available everywhere online, wherever good books and sometimes not good books are sold. And I'm actually been really, really thrilled with the response that it's gotten so far. I've been very, very flattered. It's been a huge thing. Thank you very much to everybody who has supported it as well. And thank you very much, Lee, as well, for all your kind words and for giving me the opportunity to plug it as well here. I really, really appreciate it.
That's no problem. And if people wanted to reach out to yourself, because obviously you're not just a great author, you're a podcaster, you're a writer, your film tweets. I always enjoy seeing what the Mooney family movie is as well. So where can kind of people find your podcast and find you also on social media?
I co-host a couple of podcasts, actually. So I co-host the 250, which is a weekly journey through the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. So we are doing we basically take a movie on the list each week and we discuss it, sometimes with a guest, sometimes without a guest. We sort of we chat through and we discuss it, sort of its place as a piece of cultural sort of nostalgia, or a piece of cultural conversation. The week that this is coming out will be actually leading into we'll be doing Star Wars, which was obviously a big film that we're very excited to be talking about. So we'll be celebrating Life Day by talking about Star Wars. I co-host another podcast, which is the Scanon podcast, which is a much more Irish focused thing. It's a weekly film discussion where we do stuff like we talk about the top 10, we talk about the new releases, we talk about what we watched and stuff. And it's me and a bunch of other Irish film geeks. We have a little panel that we rotate in and out. So it's sort of a kind of a younger, hipper, more modern weekly discussion of film, and it's more dynamic, it's more exciting. And there's a lot of interesting people on it that I'm very, very excited and very flattered that I get to kind of share the platform with. And I think the week that this is released, it will be the week before we do our top 10s of the year, so we discuss the year sort of as a retrospective as well. In terms of following me online, I run the Movie Blog, which is a website where you can find online. If you Google the Movie Blog, it's with a 0 instead of an O in Movie Blog, because I didn't get there fast enough, goddammit. And you can find me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney as well, where I am ranting about various things online, howling into the void. But I'm always glad to have a conversation with people who enjoy talking about things that I enjoy talking about as well. So feel free to come online and talk to me there as well.
And this will be for me and Dallas. This is our last original episode of the year as well. We'll have kind of two sort of best of compilations to see out the year with some of our interviews with some talent over the years as well. So you'll have them to look forward to over the kind of Christmas break when we decide to bugger off away from Scotland. So thank you very much to everyone that's joined us on the show, from people like Darren to all the guests, and to Dallas for coming and joining me on the show this year. And thanks to everyone. And I hope when Christmas comes you have a fantastic one and you enjoy Christopher Nolan, a critical study of the film on Christmas Day. It's certainly better than EastEnders, that's for sure.
And
so
happy
Merry
Christmas. You too as well. You too, comma 2. Happy Christmas, guys.
Happy Christmas.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.
Welcome to